I will go ahead and kick things off and people can trickle in along the way. So I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon to a really exciting webinar to discuss the future of workforce and workforce development and how it relates to economic development. So I am going to briefly do some introductions. So my name is Andrea Hutchins. I am lucky enough to be the host, if you will, of the webinar today. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Thomas P. Miller and Associates. And I am joined today by two just really intriguing individuals who have not only a knack for thinking outside of the box with things, but also have a knack for putting it in writing so that the rest of us can enjoy those wonderful thoughts. So today I have with me Stephen Goldsmith, who is the Derek Bach Professor of the Practice of Urban Policy and the Director of Innovations at American Government Program. I am reading this so I don't mess up any titles at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He previously served as the deputy mayor of New York and the mayor of Indianapolis, where he earned a reputation as one of the country's leaders in public-private partnerships, competition, and privatization. So welcome, Stephen. And I am also joined today with Kate Markin-Coleman, who is the founder of IAS Advising. Do you call it IAS or is it ES? I probably should. IAS, okay. Advising LLC. And was an advanced leadership fellow at Harvard University. Prior to this, she served as an executive vice president and chief strategy and advancement officer for the YMCA of the USA, increasing the Y's impact throughout the United States. And I do have to say for myself, that's been very visible over the past several years. So thank you so much for the work that you do there. So I just want to give folks a little bit of an outline on the Growing Fairly book, and then we're going to open things up to questions from the audience. We always at TPMA encourage audience participation in all of our webinars. I do have some questions already kind of set aside in case we have some shy audience members. So don't feel pressured, but it is always helpful if we have some audience engagement. We will try and wrap things up right about 4 p.m. Eastern time. And if there are trickling questions that don't necessarily get answered, I'm sure that Kate or Stephen would be really happy to help you answer those questions. Maybe later on in a follow-up email, we can get some answers out to folks. So just quickly, the book really does, if you haven't had the opportunity to read it, which I should put a plug in, it is available on Amazon, outlines the principles which argue for a more comprehensive view of skilling the needs and the current, upskilling the needs of the current and prospective workforce. They spell out the attributes of effective programs and make the case for skill-based hiring, widely distributed performance data and collaboration. And the book further emphasizes the importance of local action, which is something that we at TPMA are really firm believers in as well, to overcome the structural barriers that challenge even the most determined would-be learners. So Kate and Stephen, because there's a small number of panelists, I think we have plenty of time to be able to, interrupt one another, do a little bit of back and forth, if you will. We're not going to have as much of a formal, you answer this as we normally would. So feel free to chime in wherever appropriate. So I'm going to kick things off with one really quick question just to kind of get the juices flowing with the audience. And so the question is really pretty broad, but I think it really does set the stage for the direction that we're going to take things today. So the first question would be, does race, equity, and or geographic location impact our collective systems? And if so, how? So I don't know who wants to go first, but we'll let you. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, let me just maybe start. Race, what were the three categories in your question?
So the three categories were geographic location, race, and equity, and how those things either collectively or individually impact our systems.
Yeah, I'm not sure those are three things or one thing in many places, if you think about it. So I want to get back to kind of Kate's observations of the folks that she interviewed and also worked with at the Y, and maybe people I did as mayor. But let me just start at the city level, and then Kate maybe move to the more maybe the organizational level. So there has been, even pre-COVID, when cities seem to be doing really well in their downtowns, there are many of their neighborhoods were not doing so well. we see this in Indianapolis, right, where, I consider home and where I was a elected official. And, the technology jobs are growing and poverty is growing at the same time. Poverty is growing disproportionately in certain neighborhoods more than anywhere else. Those neighborhoods are not all folks of color, but predominantly folks of color. So if you look at equity in terms of opportunity, there's different ways to define equity, but let's just think about equity of opportunity. If you live your life in a neighborhood where you're immersed in violence, where the transit to get to work is not very good, where the relationships that somebody in a more prosperous neighborhood would have that help you get a job or know how to, maneuver through the system, those don't exist. That's not fair. It's not equitable, and it has a very significant racial effect to it. So those are the obstacles that many of the people that we met are in the book are trying to mitigate or resolve, but those are substantial obstacles. Kate?
I think the only thing that I would add to that, which is really the flip side of what you said before we get into kind of some of the details of the book and what we saw when we spoke to people, is that where people are facing obstacles, there's also an absence of opportunity, and the workforce system as it's constructed now doesn't actually adequately overcome the obstacles or create more opportunity, which isn't to say that there aren't organizations and regions that are doing a good job, but sort of writ large. And that was really the reason that we set out to write this book, right? We saw a system that wasn't fair, that was characterized by increasing income inequality. And so we set out to find programs and policies that would address and create opportunity. So that was where we started with this book.
I have to tell you, when we first met and we're talking about the book when it had first come out, the values at TPMA are so in line with some of the recommendations that you all have made, which is part of the reason that I wanted to have you on for our audience. So one of the things that we have found collectively, we've been doing webinars now for over a year, our audience is often very, very focused on solutions-based outcomes. And so from the research that you all were able to glean, I'd really be interested, not only from the concerns of the job seekers, but also just across the board, when you were conducting your research, what were the common concerns that you found as it related to the system?
Well, because why don't we split it this way, Andrea? What if I talked about common concerns that we heard in people?
Okay.
And then let Steve, honestly, we heard concerns at the individual level, at the program level, and then at the systems level. So let me just throw out a couple of them at the people level, and maybe even at the program level. The people level is, if I invest my time and energy in more education and training, will there be a payoff at the end? If I decide I want to engage in more training or education, how am I going to balance my financial and logistical needs as I'm trying to participate in that program? Right. So those are pretty, and the other one that we shouldn't minimize is, can I really do it? Can I really succeed in this program? At the program level, and I'm trying to reach back, we held up a group because one of the things the pandemic allowed us to do was to actually bring people together from across the country that we might not otherwise have been able to kind of put in the same room. We stuck them in a Zoom room and they talked. Here are what some of the program people were concerns with the workforce system. We don't pay for the right things. We pay for outputs and not outcomes. we don't have a willingness to take on some risk and try something new. We don't work across organizational lines. I think that's good enough. But those are some of the things we heard from people and program leaders. Steve, you might be able to talk better about the regional stuff we heard.
Well, essentially, as Kate mentioned, we met a large number of organizations or people working in the organizations that are doing really effective work. Question is, why aren't they at scale? And the answer is that there is no workforce development system. The work that Tom Miller does is terrific in advising people and thinking about these issues. But not many places do all the parts of the system operate truly as a system, right? 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, employers, employees, workforce investment boards, right? So the mayor's office, the economic development office, the regional office, the state offices. So what we saw was there's a lot of people who need help, but are having difficulty securing it because the organization of the system, the data in the system, and the regional thinking really doesn't come together.
Interesting. Well, I do want to get back to that, the comment that you just made about things coming together, because I think that that's a really important point. But we did get one question from the audience. And so I pivot over to there just to hopefully encourage some additional questions. So you referenced the movie American Factory in the book. Would you say that the issue Dayton, Ohio was facing was a systems and a policy issue?
Interesting question. So we were fortunate enough to be part of a convening in Indianapolis about American Factory. And it occurred at a new site pretty close to the Lucas Stadium. And as I looked to my right during that meeting, I essentially saw, close enough, the site of the GM assembly plant in Indianapolis that not only had been closed, the whole thing had been torn down. That was the sister plant to the Dayton plant, right? So as you sat there talking about American Factory, I looked out at the manufacturing jobs that not only figuratively, but literally had vanished from the face of the earth, right? It was just totally gone. So this question then becomes, what about those folks? Many of them have jobs like they did in Dayton, but those jobs aren't really on a ladder of mobility and future success. They're stuck in those jobs. So how do we identify the skills they need to get better jobs and livable wages and improve the lives of themselves and their families? So the American Factory was both a movie about unionism, but union jobs, but it was also really a story about self-esteem and work and how can I make the lives of my family better. And that was an important moment for us as part of this journey of interviewing folks about the book.
Kate, do you have anything that you want to add on that one?
I don't think so, because I'm not sure that I understand, and if I do understand, the difference between system and policy and why that's important, in the sense that systems issues either are reflected in policy or policy contributes to systems issues. So I have a hard time slicing them.
Sure.
What I was trying to read into the question was whether there was a political question embedded in the language that I was trying to interpret. So I'll hold until the questioner indicates whether that is in fact what is intended.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Dr. Wilson, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that. If not, we will go ahead and kind of moving back to the question that you had initially spurred in my mind, Stephen, when you were talking about some of these entities not only coming together, but actually working together. How does education, economic development, and nonprofits intersect? I mean, this is something that we at TPMA work with a lot, but how do you define collaboration among those entities?
Well, they all collaborate in the soft sense of the word collaborate. I mean, they get along, but if you really looked at it, do they use the same taxonomy when they talk about skills? Do 11th and 12th graders get the apprenticeship programs they need in developing the skills that they need, right? Do the two-year colleges offer discrete training programs that will provide more jobs, more skills for jobs that are open or projected? So what we meant was that there needs to be an actual collaboration around a language of skilling, right? The currency of skilling that's transparent, that has a return on investment, that helps navigators, coaches, and aspiring learners understand what their options are realistically. So the pieces are all there, but there's no natural organizing of those pieces in most regions.
Could I follow up on that one?
Sure.
And I'm going to pull this from some of the research in the book, some observations that we made, which are embedded in the principles, but I think pulling them out for the purposes. First of all, one of the things that we have to recognize, and this is the reason you need collaboration between government and the private sector and social sector, right? So if you recognize that the skilling needs of the population vary widely, all the way from the justice-involved youth who has trouble with self-control and needs work on executive skill development, to the incumbent worker at Walmart who needs some reskilling. If the range of needs in the population is that broad, then you need to bring together a broad range of organizations to address the skilling needs of those individuals. So the kid that might need executive skills development is going to be in a very different program than the employer-led reskilling or upskilling effort. So that's one observation. A second observation is that, you and I or Steve, we may not face major challenges getting to work or with childcare or whatever it might be. But lots of people in the system face all sorts of challenges that get in the way of their participating in a program, actually completing the program, much less participating and sustaining employment. So that means you need to have people who can provide wraparound services. Well, that may be the social sector, or that may be municipal government, in addition to the training entity, in addition to the employer. And then the last observation I would make is that we've got to acknowledge the failures in our K through 12 system, so that lots of people who are coming into skilling programs lack basic math or reading. And yet they're feeling a lot of pressure to have occupational training to get a job, which means that the community college and the training organization have to figure out how to combine learning in basic adult education and in occupational training so you can get that adult into a job quickly. So there's no way to do it without collaboration. And the only other thing I want to add to what Steve said is, and Steve said this, I just apologize for restating it, but we have a pretty formal definition of collaboration. We're not talking about an ad hoc, let's get together. We're talking about something convened, maybe by the mayor, that has a formal kind of assessment of the situation. They've established common goal, common agenda. They have some number of initiatives that they're all committed to. They're sharing data, so on and so forth. So it's pretty formal.
Well, and definitely sounds like, it does take some leadership and buy-in from the top, right? So, you all have some experience sitting in those positions, but for those communities where there might not be that leadership at the top, how do you feel like communities at the local level can help spur that vision?
Great.
Well, Kate has some interesting kind of diagnostic about collaboration. Let me just start kind of at a more general level, which is we've suggested in the book, Growing Fairly, that there's two major components. One's the leadership that convenes the stakeholders, and the other is the nonprofit or the intermediary that manages the stakeholders. I don't mean like heavy-handed management, but a real collaboration. And that real collaboration is based on a real-time data. In the places we looked at, that was MZ burning glass data, as well as kind of layered on top of Department of Labor information as well. So who could be that convening leader? Well, it could be the mayor, it could be the county executive, could be the business community, right? It could be the Chamber of Commerce or whatever the name would go by in an average city that would bring folks together. Now, the mayor, right? Much of the workforce authority is over in the Workforce Investment Board, and different mayors appoint different members, and business appoints different members. But there's not a lot of close coordination in most cities between the mayor and the Workforce Investment Board. It's more between the mayor and the Economic Development Group. So we're just suggesting that there needs to be a convener by the leader and a manager. And I think that leadership function is best done by an elected official because he or she has the authority to do it, but it can be done by the business community. You know, in San Diego that we featured in the book, the Workforce Investment Board formed a nonprofit, and that nonprofit itself became the intermediary, and the Workforce Investment Board became the leader. So we see different models around the country.
Steve, though, in Houston, the stimulus came from the business community, which I think is an interesting kind of perspective to have on it. So the business community came together and said, we need to create X number of jobs. And I'm trying to think in the effort in Chicago, whether it had its, and in each case, Steve's mentioned that the mayor takes an important convening role. But was the Chicago example where the initial stimulus came from the business community?
And the philanthropic community, both.
Yeah. And then what about Atlanta? Where was the initial stimulus?
Yeah, these are interesting questions. I'm not sure you're allowed to ask me questions, so I don't know about that.
Gosh, I'm so sorry.
I'm enjoying it. You're actually making my job easier.
So we did write about a number of different models. In Atlanta, the lead organization is the United Negro College Fund, UNCF. Houston, it was the business community. It formed a subsidiary. San Diego was the Workforce Investment Board and the mayor. So Chicago was foundations, in large part, philanthropy. I think all we're saying is it doesn't have to be the same model in each city, but it does need to be somebody.
Sure. Well, and I think that that's so incredibly important, especially as I mentioned before, for some of our audience members who are the boots on the ground, right? And so I think sometimes there is this overwhelming feeling of, I'm not in control. I'm not the mayor. So how do I take this project forward? How do I, lead from the front, if you will, without necessarily being at the front? So let's actually go ahead.
Let me just say, because I think it's important, because I know what Thomas Miller does, and I know who the listeners are in large part. There is going to be, so let's say the Workforce Investment Board can see the future better than others, right? That they're immersed in it and they see the needs, but they can't really manage those high-powered stakeholders on their own. In every community, there is a champion. The president of the local university, the mayor, the county executive, the head of the business community, the largest foundation. Go find the champion and explain the cause. The cause is so clear. The remedies are there. There's going to be a champion that has clout in that community. And I think that person can be activated by the Workforce Investment Board leadership.
Sure.
I'm going to add one other thing to that, which is because what we're proposing is at a relatively grand and aggregate level. The other thing that we saw in different cities where you might not have as formal an arrangement is that organizations began to create formal arrangements between themselves, which could then become the foundation of something at the regional level. So almost all of the high-performing organizations that we looked at had the nonprofits had very strong relationships with employers, with private sector employers. They began to have relationships with other nonprofits that could provide support services. So there's this, once you get the beginning of a seed of organic working together, then you can elevate it and sort of propose at the leadership level to formalize something across more players. That could be Kate Pollyanna talking, I'm not sure.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, we actually see that on a regular basis, right? I mean, Stephen was talking about some of the work that we do, and, we put together plans and we do a lot of different strategies, but you're right. It does take that one kind of initial seed and that initial champion to really kind of get the momentum going. That I don't think that's Pollyannish at all. I think it's aspirational. So that actually does lead to kind of a similar question, but I'm not sure that you all actually address this in the book. So if you don't have an immediate response to this, we can move on. But I did get a question from the audience that says, what do you feel the responsibility is of the private sector in addressing the livable wage issue? And what solutions do you all envision there?
Well, that's a political question, actually. I don't mean that in a harsh sense. I mean, I think reasonable people can differ on that. First of all, if we want folks to get to a livable wage, then I would put government policy and operations at the center of that discussion. Either, and you can do this right in two ways, you can just legislate a wage, or you can create ladders of opportunity to get people to that wage. And Kate and I are of different politics, we may have different answers to that. So let me just kind of put that aside for a second. Businesses, right, operate in a competitive environment. And so they operate within rules of the game. So you can't really expect one business to operate differently than another. I would say, though, talking about Pollyannish, that it's enlightened self-interest to help train and upskill your own labor. What we saw in Walmart, in IBM, and other employers is that helping employees understand what their skills are, helping measure those skills, helping badge those skills, and promoting from within are very powerful. And they are ways to get to a living wage, even if you don't start at a living wage. And I hope that would be an answer to your question.
So we joke here. We're different ends of the political spectrum. But we always say that we had no arguments over the recommendations that you see in the book because we feel like they were so common sense and because they evolved from the conversations that we had. And they are fundamentally not political, we believe. So in the spirit of that observation, even though there might be some other stuff I would legislate, I think Steve gave a great answer.
That means we disagree, but we're not telling you why.
Possibly so.
No, I mean, honestly, though.
Both and.
I love that. So this does open up a window of opportunity to really kind of talk a little bit more about the actual principles in the book. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to just kind of, I mean, it sounds like there's a common thread that the principles were really created based on conversations and research, but was there anything else that went into creating the individual principles in the book? And then if you wouldn't mind just kind of touching on what those principles are.
Yeah, so the principles really did derive from our conversations with hundreds of people that we spoke to who run organizations, who staff organizations, who participate in organizations. I would like to say that we did have an initial bar in our screening process. So we only spoke to organizations, two-part only, that had had some sort of third-party evaluation. Didn't have to be a randomized controlled trial, but something. And we only spoke to organizations that would let us speak to participants. So I don't know if that was a way of being an honest broker, but we really wanted to talk to people who had experienced the programs. So they derived from that. Now, there was a logic to the framing. So we developed from our conversations 10 principles, 2 relating to the people for whom the system is designed, 4 relating to the attributes of high-performing programs, and 4 relating to the system as a whole. And I won't go through all of them except to say this. System, as I alluded to before, needs to start with people. It needs to start with the needs of the people and understand the range of needs is very broad, and therefore the providers to the system need to likewise be very broad. At the program level, even though the programs we looked at were doing different kinds of occupational training, they had certain characteristics in common. I'll say what they are, but won't describe, and someone can ask if they're interested. They personalize to the extent that it is reasonable. They contextualize learning, meaning they combine basic skills with adult skills with occupational or career readiness. They provide supports to people. And they, oh Lord, and what else do they do? Contextualize, personalize, support, and provide bridges to employment. So earn and learn apprenticeships and so on. And then at a systems level, Steve, how embarrassing that was.
Right, no one would know that you missed a word if you hadn't admitted it.
Yeah, honesty is such a bad policy with me sometimes.
I would just join by saying the foundation of the system has to be data, real-time data about what the skill makeup is in that region. What labor has, what employers want, and what training can provide. And it has to enlighten that, and that should configure all of the pieces can then array their delivery around those real needs. And that needs this collaboration foundation, which we call an intermediary that we talked about earlier in respect to your questions. So that would be one. And then those efforts then need to be able to provide transparent information to a learner about what he or she needs. What's the return on investment? If I take this course, what job will I get when I complete it? That needs to be able to tell the community college or training provider, look, we're minus a 16-week front-end course on advanced manufacturing or tool and die work. I mean, it needs to be very specific about what can be done. As we saw in the IBM situation, there needs to be an individualized learning record that records those accumulating kind of training of specific skills. So in other words, the system is a real system based on skills, what we call the currency of skills, and based on data that allows placements to be made much more effectively. Think about it as data is providing the rungs on the ladder that are now missing.
It's like you saw my questions in advance. So I was actually going to ask you next to talk a little bit more about the currency of skills, just kind of help to I guess, broaden that perspective, if you will, and talk just a little bit about why you included that in the book and what that means at a local level.
Well, a lot of people around the country talking about skills, and we got most deeply involved in it in the book in Atlanta, where there was a project like we mentioned a minute ago with the United Negro College Fund and the mayor of Atlanta, supported by Strata and MZ Burning Glass data to say, okay, folks that need more mobility, what skills do they have? What are the skills needed in the community? Let's look at what the data shows us about equity in the skilling. You know, how disproportionate is it really where folks at the top and folks at the bottom by race, color, ethnicity, that sort of thing? How is all that open up? But once you get there, right, you can't just say skills, right? The HR director in the company needs a way of if we're not going to use 2 and 4 year degrees exclusively, then how does that HR director understand what skills the candidate really has? Well, there needs to be some learning record. Well, how does the candidate understand what skills she needs to get? Well, there needs to be a way to say, this program offers this skill for this job. And so the currency of skills is a real currency that goes between employer, employee, and training and makes this system work much more effectively.
And is that something that, because I've noticed just kind of at the 10,000 foot view that when we talk about a currency of skills, there is kind of the traditional, like you mentioned, 4-year degree, maybe some certificate programs and so on in between. But you also mentioned IBM and Walmart with their own badging and their own programs and things like that. How, as a learner, or a job seeker, how am I supposed to weigh whether or not that IBM certificate is as valid or as worthy, if you will, as the currency that I'm going to get from a 2-year institution?
Okay, Kate, is that you or me?
That typically is you, unless you feel like it should be me.
So the way you asked it makes it a little difficult to answer. So one thing we wanted the learner to know is, particularly if he or she has a navigator or coach that's helping them, or even a workforce board advocate, right? In this case, what happens to people like me who take this course? Let's talk about the course before we get to the community college per se, because I may just need a course in order, but maybe I want to be a nurse, so I need the degrees. So what happens to people who get this degree from this institution or take this course from this institution? What happens to them, right? And so once we can discern that, then now let's move over to the IBM person. That person, IBM doesn't insist that you use your skills to stay in IBM necessarily. They just give you that option. They identify what your background is, what your experience is. They suggest to you that you take a certain course or a certain training module, and then you'd be eligible for this job, right? So they're both machine reading their open jobs and the bios of their current candidates. And then, as Kate has mentioned before, then IBM did away with about 50%. 50% of its jobs don't require college degrees anymore, right? So they're actually behind, right? They're supporting their rhetoric. So it can work across employers. That's why you need the currency of skills, or it can work inside the employer if the employer is large and enlightened.
Large and has created a path. I mean, one of the things that IBM has also done is sort of thought through career pathways such that the indications are, if you take this certification, these are the paths that are open to you. So it's a multi-pronged effort there.
Yeah.
And I think the encouraging thing I would say is that IBM may be the most advanced at what they're doing, although I really don't, I say that without really knowing that, but there are a number of other employers who are beginning to do the same thing, which I think is a cause for optimism.
Absolutely. And it is interesting. So I've worked in both public and private sector, government side and not. And so the government side of me knows that the government at some point is going to come up with some idea to be able to take over, the skills currency and I don't know, put some sort of a rubber government stamp on it. But in the meantime, I think the answer that you gave is 100% what I was looking for. When I look at the workforce boards and how they are able to, advise folks that are coming in, or even advise employers. We hear every now and then from some major employers who, I think they're scared to create their own skills-based program. So we actually work with an organization, it's called 180 Skills. They do quite a bit of online training, and they have been encouraging people to come up with their own kind of career pathways. So it's a really interesting time that we're in right now, for sure.
So it's interesting for other reasons, right? Which, let's when you're talking, I was thinking about, the workforce boards that you all work with. And let's think about how they could be even more effective. One would be that the federal and state governments give them more discretion, right? And so instead of all these administrative rules, they allow them to be flexible and do what's needed to help a person. That's one thing. Second is they could support them with more funding for data analysts and real-time data, so that they have the capacity and the access to the data. Third, they could and they could work with their cities who are now allowed to use their ARPA dollars to support their workforce dollars, right? They're very flexible dollars, and nothing's more important than upskilling in jobs, particularly for folks in challenged neighborhoods. So if you said, okay, mayor, county executive, and you're the workforce board chair or the director, you want better jobs for your folks in this community. One way to do it is to help have a joint project with us around data and skilling, and you can use your ARPA dollars for that. So there are lots of options here, and this is the time to actually move forward.
We talk a lot about ARPA dollars because a lot of communities, they have this money and it's this giant pile and they're not exactly sure, what to do with it. But you're 100% correct. I mean, anything to retrain, upskill, or put folks back to work, or improve the quality of life, especially of underserved populations. It's definitely someplace that we continue to encourage people to invest instead of just investing in an HVAC system, which we have actually heard of communities doing that. So that is something that, think more long-term, right? So, yeah. So speaking of COVID, I'm curious. Oh, yes.
Could I just add one thing, and which is that when I mentioned that we convened a group of some of the really top organizations, and we may have said this before, but it bears repeating, which is that we need to focus on outcomes and evaluating organizations such that we actually know who's doing a good job, not because it feels like a good job, but because it's resulting in job placement and job continuity. And that too helps individuals in the decision-making process if that kind of information were available and easily accessible.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think we've kind of touched on the cursory points of is COVID. How did COVID and the pandemic impact the research that you all were doing and the outcomes in this book?
So let me start with that. And we have been asked that question before. And I will say that the hypotheses and the recommendations we developed, I don't think are any different because COVID happened. And we set out to write a book that would address inequities in the workforce development system. When we started, more open positions than people to fill them, many people underemployed, flipped during COVID. Now we're in that situation even more so. So in terms of the actual recommendations, I don't think it impacted it. Now, it impacted the mechanics of what we did. At first, there were organizations that literally disappeared because they had to think about how to operate in this environment. Some came back, one or two, in fact, just sort of dropped out of the world. Once people got somewhat stabilized, having the ability to speak to anybody anywhere in the country without worrying about plane flights actually made it easier and allowed us to bring people together in one room, one Zoom room, that we would not have been able to bring together otherwise, and had some very productive conversations from that.
It's funny. Have you all read the book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat? So it is funny. This is almost like the second iteration of flattening the world, right? You all are obviously in a different location than I am, and so on and so forth, and even with the panelists. So it does open up a world of possibilities, not only for communication and business, but also for workforce and for learning. So along that vein, we are coming up close to our hour mark here. So I wanted to just give you all an opportunity, if you were speaking directly to a workforce board and or an economic development organization within a community. So I have two questions for you. What are the key kind of fundamental pieces of your book and of the research that you conducted that you think that they need to really focus on? And then two, just where do people start? Because I know that a lot of times, we've talked about data, we've talked about people, but how do you start?
Who goes first, Kate?
Could you rephrase, just say the first part of the question, because
Sure.
I was thinking about my second, and then I'll start with the first part maybe, and Steve, you do the where do we start?
Yes. So what is the one takeaway from your book that you would want somebody at the local level to really kind of focus in and hone in on?
We might have different answers for this. So mine is number one, we absolutely have to have an expansive definition of skills. Otherwise, what constitutes skilling? Otherwise, we miss way too many people. And then the second thing is we all talk about, or skill-based hiring is a big part of the conversation, but it needs to be skill-based hiring married with cross-sector collaboration, because you can't do one without the other. So those would be kind of where I would want people to focus. But Steve, you might have a different answer on that one.
Well, let me just talk to your client base for a second in answering your question. I don't think they'll find this offensive. There was a long time ago when I was beginning as mayor, it was right after the book Reinventing Government came out. And in that book was a now well-quoted phrase about good people working in bad systems, right? Which is kind of what we found in city government, really good people in really crummy systems. And the equivalent of workforce is there's really good people who are working often with both hands tied behind their back, right? They are the tip of the spear, and it looks like they have a lot of money, but they don't have a lot of money compared to the community college, a four-year college, the city, the state. So I would say that given the importance of their work, go find the leverage points that allow them to be more effective, right? Go find the foundation community foundation that will support their work. Go find the champion, put the pieces together, and understand how strategic partnerships that are cross-sector collaborations will produce the changes necessary. And in that regard, and kind of finally, I guess, to tie it to Kate's answer, the workforce investment boards are not in the business traditionally of K-12 education, right? They're not often in and of themselves able to order employers to do apprentice programs. They can nudge and the like. They need leadership to create many more apprentice programs, much more contextualized learning, more childcare, better transportation system. They can find Joe who comes in for a job 4 referrals, but if he can't get to the job in less than 2 hours' time, it's not a real referral. Those are outside their control, and they should advocate loudly. Now is the time, and equity demands it.
One of the things that we saw across the board during the pandemic, at least at the start of it, I think when nobody knew what to do, it became very obvious very quickly that they weren't going to be able to do anything in a vacuum, right? They weren't going to be able to stay siloed. And I do think that COVID, if anything good has come from all of this, besides the Zoom, it really is the fact that folks have gotten used to working together in a way that they never have in the past. So I think your book is coming out at a really timely point. So anything to add as far as the first steps, Kate, that you think that people might want to look at taking to get moving? No? Okay. All right. Well, we will go ahead and wrap things up. I do want to always reiterate to our audience that we do put these webinars on YouTube. So feel free to share it with friends, families, colleagues, whatnot, or go back for reference points. And then if there were any questions that didn't get asked either during the webinar or that come to mind after you read the book, I know that both Stephen and Kate have been very, very good with communicating with us and answering any questions that we might have. And I'm sure that they would do the same for our audience members. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for writing the book and putting the principles into place for all of us. And we just appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Take care, all.